afternoon. My name is Rachwald. I manage the security strategy team in Perva. I'm going to be walking you through what we call cyber vigilantes, which is some of the things that the security community is doing to kind of track what hackers are doing, and also, more importantly, to counteract what they're doing. So this is not a product pitch, although I'll talk a little bit about the product at the end of it, but I'm not a product slut by any means. First, I'm going to start off with a little bit about cybersecurity today. We have noticed a couple of things. We look at, we spend a lot of time in hacker forums. We look at what hackers are doing with respect to building new capabilities, new attack software, and so forth. One of the key things that we've noticed is the industrialization of hacking. So, for example, we're going to blog on this sometime next week. This is the latest example. There's a brand new package that was published actually to code.google.com where you can, in an automated fashion, friend people. And so you can, go onto Facebook, put in a URL, and then just hit those people and just start automating all of the different friend requests. Then what happens is if that person, if those people accept, then it automatically goes into their profile, captures their personal information, and downloads all of their photos. So this is sort of a new instantiation. In this case, of course, there's no vulnerability. It's just the way it was built. So we also see this, and actually on Monday as well, we're going to be publishing a report on SQL injection and how SQL injection is becoming automated and some of the major tools that hackers are using as well. To that point, attack techniques and vectors keep changing at an ever rapid pace. For example, one of the things we'll be pointing out about SQL injection, with respect to SQL injection, one of the first things you do is obviously a Google dork search. And the way Google bypassed that was if you search something several times, eventually it would stop and say, "Are you human?" And the way they bypassed that is they actually started doing Google dork searches through bots. So that way it would jump around from different computers and bypass the whole question of doing some sort of mechanized search. So attack techniques and vectors keep changing at a rapid pace. Tools and platforms keep evolving. So we've seen this again. Hackers, by definition, are early adopters. This is what they do. So I'm going to walk through a couple of points here. Reality check number one, hackers know the value of data better than the good guys. So we have a couple of data points to highlight this. On your upper left, you have a chart that shows the value of credit card information, email accounts, yada, yada. Symantec has put this together in the past. This highlights the value of specific bits of data. Kind of interesting. On your lower right, you see from a Russian hacker forum that some dude is trying to sell 2,000 US credit card numbers and 1,300 EU credit card numbers. And he's got a phone number to call him in case you want to negotiate that deal. My point here is there's a huge black market for this stuff. And it's starting to bleed over into intellectual property and so forth. It's a pretty solid market. In some cases, we've seen where you can go in and automatically monetize the credit card numbers that you've stolen. And so this is the key thing to keep in mind because this is important to know what you're up against. Another one, this is interesting. This came up, I think about 6 months ago or so. This is one website where they posted up a series of websites that had been they were vulnerable to SQL injection, and what the hacker was doing was selling admin access. So if you look at the third column from your left, you'll see level of control. That column here says full site admin control in virtually all of these. I'll focus in on one specific one, which is the Central Command of the U.S. Army. For this price of an iPad, you can have full control and root access to that site. One of the interesting ones here, which is about, it's actually, unfortunately, it's blocked by this particular graphic, but it was actually for the U.S. Army's pharmacological website. And they were selling that one for about $3.99, which I thought was kind of interesting because, of course, in that instance, what you can do is send Viagra emails from the U.S. Army website, as opposed to, some sort of doctored up website. And that way it would look real, of course, and that would help your scams if that's what you wanted to do. This particular hacker actually was out of Kuwait. and he has a website. He took this down after he was at it. Brian Krebs, this was actually came originally from our blog, and Brian Krebs wrote about this, and he's since taken his site and put it behind a paywall, and he's renamed himself a security researcher, and this is all in the name of security research. As I said earlier, hackers are by definition early adopters. One of the things that we did, which was kind of interesting, is we looked at one hacker forum, which is a pretty large one, and we used their search capability to understand what it is that they're talking about. We looked at a lot of different things. I'll show some more data in a moment. But to highlight the early adopter point that I'm trying to make here, what we saw is, with respect to mobile, is we saw how certain things like Android, BlackBerry, Nokia, iPhone, we saw a dramatic growth in the amount of discussion with respect to these things. And you know, it's as exponential, if not faster, than the sales of some of these things. In fact, Nokia and BlackBerry, they're, as you saw, some of you may have seen the BlackBerry earnings news today, they're tanking. But there's still a great interest in trying to hack into these things. So some of these discussions are about, hey, I bought a new iPhone, or it could be about jailbreaking, things like that are relatively innocuous. But it includes lots of discussions that things that are not so innocuous, malware, and how to break in via passwords, that type of thing. Reality check number 3. This is a discussion I was having with a quasi-customer earlier today on our booth. Good guys have more vulnerabilities than time and resourcing can manage. So what I did is I went to Netcraft, and as of the end of July, there were 357 million-ish websites. You assume this is the 230 vulnerabilities. This is a number I got from White Hat's vulnerability report that they do quarterly. Big fan of that. And then we just assume just 1% of all these sites actually transact data in some format. They actually engage in some degree of e-commerce or banking or something that we would consider a data transfer. So basically what you get is 821 million-ish total vulnerabilities worldwide that are in active circulation. This was in a recent report that we put out. If you try to compare this, I think there are roughly 10,000 maybe security professionals worldwide. Maybe I'm off by a factor of 2, it's 20,000. You kind of get to see the issue that you're dealing with. And then of course in terms of trying to get developers to work on a lot of these, that's another story altogether. Next point. Attack automation is prevailing. I talked a little bit about this earlier when I talked about the industrialization of hacking, but here you have a very specific example. On Pastebin, one hacker talked about how he had used a SQL injection tool to break into a bunch of websites, and he posted up all the websites that he managed to break into. In this case, it was 5,012 SQL injectionable websites. Now, there's no way a single person trying to do a SQL injection on site after site after site could do that all by himself, or herself, with all deference to you ladies. And what he did here is he posted up all these sites, and this is interesting because it was quite indiscriminate. We went through the list, just eyeballing it, not in any serious quantitative fashion, and a lot of them were very small companies, nonprofits. There was a pet sitting service with an online payment thing. There was a couple of gyms where you would, pay for your monthly gym fee through this online system. So it's quite interesting to see how broad it was and how indiscriminate. There was also a lot of foreign companies. I'm sorry, foreign companies. So you had a lot of .co.uk, .co.fr, things like that. So, this kind of helps highlight why hacking groups can be small yet very effective, as we saw with WellSec. It also means that doesn't matter how big or small you are, at some point somebody is going to find you, and they're going to try to exploit or take advantage of some vulnerability that might be on your site. So they are fairly indiscriminate about it, and that's very much the purpose and point of automation. So my team studies hackers, and we do so. We've got a group here in the U.S. We've got got a team overseas as well. What we do is we want to help basically security professionals understand what hackers are doing. It helps you prioritize. We do this in a couple of ways. We look at what they're doing technically. So we've got a technical group that will kind of break apart some of the software that they might be using. We also look at business trends to understand how they make money. And if you understand how they make money, then you can understand how to potentially disrupt some of the operations. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Chicago, of course, the land of Al Capone. And if you remember Al, he wasn't put away for murder, extortion, stealing. He was put away for tax evasion because somebody in the FBI, an accountant, had the insight to note that he was making $1 a year according to his income tax statements, and it's tax evasion. That's why he was sent to Alcatraz. We also try to look at future directions of hacker activity. You saw some of my slides on mobility. What we think this does is it helps eliminate some uncertainties. A lot of vendors, a lot of people like to engage in what we call theoretical security, what if scenarios, or this could happen, that type of thing. We like to look at what is actually happening. We think that's an important thing. So we're focusing on actual threat, and hopefully it helps you prioritize and put some of your security efforts in focus, and as I say here, ultimately reduce some of your guesswork. So we call this cyber vigilantes. I was searching for the books on vigilantism, and this is actually on Amazon. This is one of the top ones that popped up. And I put it in because apparently this is extremely rare. This is a romance novel that is very, very hard to find in print. And since most of you look like the type of person who would read this, I thought I would include this. So, approach number one. We monitor communications. So, what does that mean exactly? We basically look at hacker forums. And there's a number of hacker forums that you can use, you can look at. Some of them are very, very exclusive and they're damn near impossible to get into, but some of them are not. But it's really important to look at these because you get an incredible insight into what's going on. What we try to do is analyze this both quantitatively and from a qualitative standpoint. From a quantitative standpoint, you can look at the topics that are being discussed. Actually, a lot of these forums have very sophisticated search engines because there's a lot of random discussions, a lot of random threads. And the best way to organize that is to wrap an effective search capability on it. The other thing you can do is just qualitative things. See if there's an interesting new topic that's being discussed on one thing or another. For example, there was one thing that came up in a forum not too long ago. It was called rankmyhack.com, where it was a hacker contest. We blogged about it. Actually, New York Times picked it up and they did a story about it about a week or two ago. It was interesting, not terribly revolutionary or anything, but it was interesting, and from a certain perspective, you could argue it was funny as hell. And then certainly we can also follow up on very specific issues. So what we did is, for the first half of 2011, we tried to break it down on one forum that had about 250,000 participants and understand what are some of the key topics that they're discussing. And I apologize for the black font there for the numbers. It's a little hard to read. But essentially, 25% of the discussions were focused on beginner hacking, which I think is interesting. So what it shows you is that there's a lot of people just coming in there to try to learn the ropes. And I pointed out earlier the rankmyhack.com thing. The problem you have is there's no really good way to understand who's good and who's not so good once they've learned some of the basics. And of course, RankMyHack was designed to kind of weed out the good from the not so good. One of the things that we did do, and I unfortunately didn't include this chart, but one of the things that I find interesting is just the growth in membership over time. So it's sort of like, a shark's jaw. It gets bigger over time, and then the teeth just keep coming through. It's the exact same sort of phenomenon we see here. The other two topics that were discussed quite heavily, hacking tools and programs and website hacking. Shouldn't be a big surprise. So there you have nearly 2/3 of the topics. Now, what I think is interesting is if you look at some of the technical discussions that are taking place on these forums. So we looked at some very specific terms like DDoS, SQL injection, spam. You see them all up there. Number one was actually DDoS. Very interesting to me, and I guess it's because I always thought DDoS was kind of old, but it isn't. You know, people still rely on it. You know, taking a website down is still a pretty effective means to let's just say, you know, enrage somebody. But not too far behind was SQL injection, and there's a lot of tutorials and a lot of discussions on finessing your SQL injections. A lot of information on creating SQL injection dictionaries, if you like, to better fine-tune your SQL injection attacks. And then, of course, lots of instructions and so forth on what tools and programs to do. So, in fact, on Monday, we're going to release, I call it a dissertation on SQL injection. So what we did is we managed to monitor a bunch of SQL injection attacks, you know, several million of them. And what we're going to do is publish some details about how they operate, what are some of the you know, frequencies with which they happen, how do they happen, and some of the common tools. The two main tools that were used by hackers, one was called SQL Map, and the second one was called Havij, H-A-V-I-J, which comes out of, so I believe it was developed in Iran. Havij means something in Farsi. I don't know what that means. Approach number two is understanding business models. In this case, this is an example courtesy Microsoft. Microsoft did something interesting. They identified some of the servers that were generating spam from the Rustock spam engine, and they notified the FBI, and the FBI shut them down. They actually went into the physical locations and got rid of those servers. And spam volume fell overnight by 30% worldwide. It was pretty dramatic. Spam levels, unfortunately, have risen back up as other people have stepped in to fill in the gap. But it's an interesting example, going back to my Al Capone analogy from earlier. I think this was really cool. One thing that we also saw, which was interesting, was a little contest between SpyEye and Zeus, some of the two main bots that exist out there. SpyEye actually had something called a kill Zeus capability, where if it was infecting a PC, would check and see if Zeus was on it, and if it was, it would remove it. And so that way it turned out to be a SpyEye machine and not a Zeus machine. Kind of interesting. We also saw towards the latter part of last year that they were discussing kind of getting together and doing a merger, which doesn't seem to have happened. In fact, one of the things that we're going to work on is the mobile version. We actually did an analysis of the mobile, or ZITMO, version of Zeus. ZITMO stands for Zeus in the mobile. And there's right now a SPITMO, SpyEye, in the mobile. And it's quite interesting. We'll do a little compare and contrast with those two. Approach number three is looking at things from a technical standpoint. I unfortunately missed the talk, but earlier today, or no, it's later, I think it's after me, there is a talk on the command and control servers and what you get by looking into command and control servers. In this case, in your upper left there, that's a command and control server for Zeus, I believe. And some folks in FBI managed to get inside the command and control server for Zeus and identify a bunch of people who were using it illegally. And they busted about 60 odd people in this case. So very interesting scenario of hacking the hackers. This one's kind of interesting. I actually, I have to say I admire the cleverness of this particular hack campaign. As you see here, this is a login spoofer. So what you would do is, after you click start, you pick whatever page you want to spoof, Hotmail, Yahoo, whatever. As you can see, this particular program came out of Algeria. And then what would happen is, this is a kit that you would get from a forum. You could create your own stuff, and then ultimately, hopefully, what you do is you manage to steal some credentials. What's interesting about the guy who programmed this is he put in a little back door so that if I developed this and all of you downloaded it and managed to steal, let's say there's 100 of you in the room, each of you stole 10 credentials, it'd be 1,000 stolen credentials that all get sent back to me. If you look at Algerian law, it's not as sophisticated when it comes to cyber issues. So it's illegal to hack, but it's not illegal to write hacking software. So technically he's broken no laws, he's not done anything legal, and not done anything illegal. So it's quite clever. And that's how we bypass some of that. The other thing that we do is we look at some trendy attacks. Here we have an example that actually I personally got during the IRS season. And basically saying, you know, I'm going to get $1,500 taxes, back in taxes. Probably one more that was, I think, kind of interesting was the when people died. So we saw two examples recently. One, first one was when Bin Laden died. Fake pictures went around, just spread virally all over Facebook. The second one, we saw this on our forum, although it didn't actually come to fruition. But within, I don't know, a couple hours of Amy Winehouse dying, one hacker's tried to sell. He bought up a bunch of URLs, amywinehousefuneral.com, amywinehousedeath.com, etc., a couple more like that. And then he put them up for sale on the forum. A couple of hackers actually said, hey, you're a pig. But then some people said, hey, that's pretty clever. So it's kind of interesting to see the different reactions. But that's certainly something that is interesting to watch. And then lastly, our final approach here is with respect to traffic analysis. And this is probably one of the most interesting, most revealing things. So what we do is we try to look at attack analysis. We've got applications, customers using some of our web app firewalls, and if they're kind enough to provide that data, we process it, aggregate it, and look at it. We see, as I've said earlier, lots of automated attacks. In this case, this is a screenshot where there was a bunch of servers that were infected with a bot that would conduct mass SQL injections and so forth. But what I thought was interesting is we were actually able to quantify using it was well over 10 million attack events. We're able to quantify the frequency by which people can actually do automated attacks. And we found that there was an average of 27 attacks per hour, or one probe every 2 minutes. Basically, this is somebody trying to find any type of vulnerability or something like that. Once they found, as you can see here on your left, the attack frequency would go up quite a bit, and we saw up to 25,000 attacks per hour, or 7 per minute. I'm sorry, 7 per second. So we see all this we saw this firepower quite interesting. So clearly, fighting automation is important. Now, what's interesting also is that we saw 4 main vulnerabilities that were sort of the key ones that some of the hackers were going after. SQL injection, cross-site scripting, that shouldn't surprise anybody, I imagine. But directory traversal and RFI was something that we don't see a lot or hear a lot. More importantly, we don't hear a lot about it, but we certainly saw that. And RFI and SQL injection were mostly used sort of like for reconnaissance bases. And actually, if we graphed them out, we would see that they both went in a similar frequency. They had the same sort of peaks and valleys. It's very interesting to see that. The second thing that we discovered was that reputation matters. 29% of the attack events originated from just a handful of those sources. We actually saw this with the RSA breach. So when RSA did a post-mortem of their breach where they had the seeds taken from their tokens, what they noticed is that 23 of the attack IP addresses were known bad addresses, 23 out of 30. So in other words, 7 looked legit upon introspection. We noticed a similar thing. So it's clearly, maybe not exactly the 80-20 rule, but it's a pretty decent approximation. So reputation does matter. And so it is, we believe it's important to understand and sort traffic based on reputation. If you compare what I've just talked about to, let's say, what actual hackers are doing, you can take the LulzSec initiative from a couple of weeks or months ago. And you actually notice that there's a tremendous similarity to what they did to what we saw. We didn't, to be clear, we didn't actually see any of their attacks live. We didn't witness it. None of our clients, their customers, were actually attacked by them, at least not yet. And so we saw something very similar. So actually, if you go through some of the literature, in this case, there was a report where some of the LoSec folks talked about SQL injection. No surprise there. I think this is interesting. What you have here in gray is some of the chat relays where some of the members of LoSec were communicating with each other. And what's interesting here is LOL is one of the LoSec members asking another one, Storm, would you like the RFI, LFI bot with Google bypass I was talking about? And he says, or he, she, whatever, says, I have 8,000 RFI with USP, they mean USD, Flutter crushed most server. So basically what they're saying is that they have an RFI bot that they were using to basically conduct some DDoS. So in this case, they had 8,000 servers, not PCs, but servers. So in this case, 8,000 affected servers is roughly equivalent to 24 million PCs. So it gives you an idea of some of the firepower that they had. And then another example, specifically around the Sun website, there was a cross-site scripting example that they pointed out. So to summarize here, automation is one of the key things that you're going to have to deal with. I'm sure a lot of you are thinking about it already, and deploying solutions to deter automation, CAPTCHA, things like that are very important. One other thing to consider, click rate controls. People have a tendency to click a little bit slower than machines do. Obviously, detecting known vulnerabilities and detecting attacks on those things is an important thing to do. I mentioned that there are a lot of vulnerabilities, makes it a little bit more tricky, but that's what we do. Acquire intelligence on malicious sources and apply those in real time. So I mentioned the RSA breach as an example. If they had some better intelligence on, or had some intelligence on what some of the bad sources were, they may have been in a better shape today. So. And then actually one example from the finance world is banks, they share information on fraud. They actually built a company, a website that's, like a startup, and they share information on people who are fraudulent activity. And they share that information, they've been able to reduce fraud dramatically. So we need to take a lesson from that and participate in the security community to share information on attacks. So I've been told I have to cut out. So I'm going to skip my conclusion other than to tell you that, I think what I've tried to show here, and I think one of the lessons is that, things have really shifted from a network to an app-centric type of attack. And in fact, Bloomberg published an interesting story recently where they talked about how the top 5 security vendors have seen their market share drop from 60 to 44% in the last 5 years. I think this is very, very interesting. And then, in an interesting mea culpa, McAfee published a report not too long ago, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, it's very fresh. And they basically said, we're not doing our job. Are we really protecting users and companies? Because a lot of the products and a lot of the things that you get from those guys, they're not necessarily going to help you. So with that, I've been told I have to cut off, so I will just leave you with this. If you want a copy of my slides, feel free to email me. I swear I won't send you any kind of nasty viruses or anything like that, but feel free to do that. Thank you.